Fausto Sterling, Cole, and Lamar argue that masculine and feminine gender dispositions do not conclusively form a dichotomous binary. Noteworthy, activational effects from birth through puberty and other epigenetic-sensitive developmental stages ensure that individuals become more aware of their gender and their gendered environments as early as within their first 3 years of life. This awareness is subsequently accompanied by the emergence of sex-related behavioral differences. Understanding gender-related development differences is fundamental in upholding individual wellness through effective disease management, including accounting for health disparities and implementing appropriate treatment interventions. Embodiment, which has largely been pushed by feminists in response to the biological account of sex differences, refers to the social environment producing physical and physiological traces in the nervous system. Experiences shape cognition, action, and perception. Spencer and colleagues maintain that mental activity is embodied, while thought is always grounded in perception and action. In other words, cognition and action cannot be separated. The dynamic field theory, DFT, explores the processes that influence infant decision-making and the related environmental stimuli in both short and long-term situations. The activation field stage of the theory includes planning and remembering actions, with tasks and attention-related stimuli capturing the relevant activation patterns. Infant planning abilities and task histories enable the adoption of behavioral patterns. Sophisticated skills showed by infants in mobile tasks are influenced by, and influence performance. Brain development, especially cortex differentiation into functional components, is a gradual process stemming from inter- and intracellular growth-related cues. The cues, which are part of a molecular control system, direct development until network logic becomes a self-producing state. The resultant anatomical framework creates connections between neurons and other brain areas. The length of the dendrites in the prefrontal cortex increase more than 200 times during the first 6 months after birth, which is a neural system response, especially through appropriate development that is responsible for the acquisition of fundamental cognitive skills. De Boll argues that sex-based neurotic differences do not peak until age of 14 years, around puberty. Kimura and Hampson observe that some activational effects such as changing hormonal levels are temporary. For instance, the authors suggest that sex differences favoring male spatial abilities in rodents peak during the mating season, suggesting that cognitive and motor functions fluctuate based on hormones and the environment. Cognitive patterns vary across different stages of menstrual cycles, as well as with the variation of androgen among men. Sexually dimorphic cognitive functions may be influenced by hormones, but change patterns do not conform to stereotypes. The effects of hormone-related fluctuations on cognitive patterns suggest that gender differences in cognitive abilities are functions of past and existing hormonal environments. Embodiment, which is a social process, examines the effect of social interaction on chemical signaling components of neuron development. This signaling includes the transfer of hormones, such as dopamine and adrenaline. Fausto Sterling, Cole, and Lamar explain that in rodents, maternal licking and grooming programs their offspring's neuroendocrine stress responses when they reach adulthood, while separation from the mother induces biochemical changes in the neurotransmitter receptors within the brain's limbic system, which integrates emotional states with stored memories of physical sensations. Hearing a mother's vocalization, however, modulates these effects. In human being, early social experiences are affected by the vasopressin and oxytocin neuropeptide systems responsible for forming bonds and regulating emotions. Infants' emotion systems develop through consistent interaction with their caregivers based on the fact that facial expressions have a direct impact on infants' heart rates and respiration. These physical impacts of facial expressions influence growth and neural connectivity of the brain regions that embody emotions. Common physiology-related training activities include calming, sleep cycles, eating, and eliminative or exploratory behaviors. Male infants choosing trucks and female infants choosing dolls within the first 9 to 15 months of life is interpreted as a representation of a stable sex-related attractors system. Fausto Sterling, Cole, and Lamar associate toy preferences with physical attributes such as boys being larger in size and more active than girls, who are described as little, weak, fragile, quiet, and delicate. Infant exposure determines their ability to categorize objects, a phenomenon that is recorded as early as the first 3 months of life. Fausto Sterling explains that environmental exposure accounts for several observable physical differences. Apart from toy preferences, parent-infant relationships also influence infants' physical awareness and how they utilize their bodies. Thus, toy preferences reflect an emotion outcome of their play histories with their caregivers, especially mothers. Vocalization, that is, how adults describe toys, influences infants' attraction, or lack thereof, to specific toys. According to Fausto Sterling, Cole, and Lamar, vocalization in the context of neural development contains three phases, that is, myelination, synapse formation in response to specific experiences, and the overproduction of synapses followed by synaptic pruning, also influenced by experiential input, begin before birth but occur actively in the postnatal environment, and in some cases through adolescence. The formation of synapses in the auditory cortex rises exponentially after birth, but the rate in the brain areas associated with language and vocalization is relatively slow. Early hearing and vocalizing experiences, combined with the development of critical language-related brain areas, informs the acquisition of language. Prenatal sexual differentiation is linked to maternal stress, nutrition, prenatal growth, and genetic differences. The perception of language influences brain development in infants and even fetuses. Neonates are able to differentiate rhythms in different languages owing to the development of the auditory regions of the brain's cerebral cortex within the first year. Thus, adult speech orientations induce changes in the language and auditory cortex, with girls' systems being more developed than boys at birth. The earliest gender-related differences in language development are noted within the first 6 months of life following a synaptic formation peak in the vocalization areas of the cortex. The fact that mothers are more likely to vocalize with girls and touch boys validates the fact that girls are more responsive to auditory stimuli at 12 weeks after birth compared to boys. Neuron birth, branching, and connectivity early inform call and responses in the auditory cortex. Overall, sensory development embodies processing interaction with the caregiver. According to Fausto Sterling, Cole, and Lamar, early visual and auditory attachment experiences between mother and infant affect growth-regulating brain biochemicals such as dopamine and noradrenaline, substances which in turn regulate brain maturation. Each episode of real-time cognitive emotional activity leaves some degree of synaptic change in its wake. Embodiment influences gender differences in disease development and health. Sex-related experiences initiate relevant embodiment processes, and the subsequent observable gender differences. The dynamic systems theory, DST, suggests that behaviors engaged over time affect the structure of the nervous system, which sets the foundation for subsequent change. According to the theory, behaviors emerge in specific moments, but the effects of each behavioral decision accumulate over time, with each decision setting the stage for future changes. Nonlinear subsystem interactions allow the determination and soft assembly of behaviors. Social happenstance, that is, matrilocality or patrilocality, and availability of postmenopausal female relatives, influences the choice of parenting behaviors. According to Spencer and colleagues, kicking, stepping, and walking in infants constitute repetitive behaviors that allow infants to actively participate in learning. Particularly, the coordination patterns associated with kicking are similar to those that underline stepping in newborns. Stepping disappears within the first 3 months, while kicking persists, a phenomenon associated with either the maturing of the cortical centers that inhibit the primitive stepping reflexes or the phylogenetic programming of stepping to disappear. Chubby or heavier babies are more likely to quit stepping. Spencer and colleagues suggest that behavioral patterns emerge from self-organization components, with these components in the case of stepping including posture, muscle strength, and environmental pulls that sustain or hinder leg movement. Stepping, and walking by extension, are not innate but a result of unstable patterns such as alternating steps that result in improved muscle strength, better body control, and step reorganization. Thus, stepping and walking are self-organized and emergent, depicting the assembly of multiple subsystems involved in an infant's history of activities. Variations in how the systems are organized reveals intrinsic and extrinsic control parameters that influence behavioral changes. Noteworthy, infants discover their intrinsic characteristics that improve control and coordination over a specified amount of time. Constant reorganization results in the adoption of functional and stable behavioral patterns. Self-organization and multi-causality are at the heart of development changes. Similar environmental contexts inform varied behavioral patterns. For instance, Spencer and colleagues suggest that the development of motor skills in infants is influenced by different molds or environmental contexts. Unique challenges and experiences require the implementation of multiple solutions that affect developmental pathways differently. Infants assemble biological, mechanical, and environmental components in attaining goal-directed actions and facilitating the embodiment of cognition and behavior. Fausto Sterling, Cole, and Lamar explain that for African Americans parenting 3 to 4-month-old babies, raising socioeconomic levels correlated with increased maternal care. This rise in economic levels makes fathers to daughters more available than fathers to sons. Children's first development phase occurs at 3 to 4 months and it is characterized by a great deal of instability. The first phase, also called the visual guided phase, is based on infants' interests to monitor their environments. The second phase, which is more stable, appears at 8 months. This second, or visually elicited target phase, involves infants' interests in hand movements without reliance on visual monitoring. Spencer and colleagues challenge these development stages through the argument that reaching moves beyond visuals as the primary factor to include motivation. While visuals determine the perception of objects, motivation informs reachability and subsequent planning. The unstable nature of the first development phase is associated with passive and active forces. Neonatal starting points for gender differences include greater maturity of the cortical brain in female infants, variations in crying and fussing, and variations in motor or sensory development, brain size and average weight. The factors associated with maternal dyadic communication include physical size, sleep and fuss patterns, and the level of neural development. These communication patterns exhibit early sex differences as early as the first 6 months after birth. Symmetrical communication patterns involve mutual engagement between the mother and the infant, while asymmetric communication encompasses one partner engaging the other in passive unilateral communication with the other partner who is socially disengaged. The history and timing of communication influences the type of relationship formed between infants and their parents. For instance, boys are more likely to exhibit self-regulation difficulties, thereby taking longer to transition from symmetrical to asymmetrical communication, with this transition already having stabilized the mother-daughter communication patterns by the first 3 to 9 months of life. Gender-based differences that exist at birth develop into vocal, physical, and emotional interaction patterns that could be measured as early as the 3rd month after birth. Pre- and post-birth related gender differences are exhibited by both parents and infants. Dyadic parent-infant interactions shape the nervous system to the extent of overlapping behaviors emerging. Fausto Sterling, Cole, and Lamar assert that the differences in neural development systems, either through the central or peripheral nervous systems, influence gender development problems, including autism spectrum disorders, dyslexia, and attention deficit disorder. Children raised by depressed mothers exhibit poorly developed regulatory, emotional, and social skills. This phenomenon is associated with the poor development of the underlying physiological systems responsible for social engagement, such as the cardiac vagal tone, as well as cortisol and serotonin levels. The parent-infant synchrony influences the outcomes of feeding and withdrawal disorder treatment interventions. By 6 months, infants become partially autonomous as they transition from primarily interacting with the mother into independence, including choosing objects. Even before 6 months, children are able to identify men and women by their faces and voices. Fausto Sterling, Cole, and Lamar suggest, and I quote, "From 18 months to 3 years more sophisticated knowledge emerges, with the average timing differing by sex. At 18 to 24-month-old girls, but not yet boys, have gender stereotyped knowledge, gender-typed visual preference and recognize labels. By 20 months, they can actively label according to gender, a skill boys exhibit in subsequent months. By 22 months, girls can imitate gender-typed activities, again a skill which boys develop a few months later." The authors correlate the adoption of gender-related competencies with the adoption of sex-related behaviors. Toy and language preferences emerge immediately. Infants are able to passively distinguish between adult males and females, but before they can acquire knowledge on gender stereotypes or self-label as males or females. From 18 months, Children collect gender-related information and subsequently implement it at 2 years, with girls becoming more gender competent than boys. De Boll and colleagues support the fact that girls display sex-type personality traits at an earlier age than boys. Same-sex peer affiliation and gender labeling appear between the first 2 and 3 years of life, and as such, gender competencies, especially knowledge of one's gender, underscore playmate preferences. Softly assembled behaviors are temporary platforms that provide room for experimenting and development. Behaviors, and diseases by extension, emerge from subsystem interactions that transition from one state to another and are subsequently characterized by sustained stability. For instance, Fausto Sterling, Kroll, and Lamar suggest that variations in the growth rate of the nervous systems in boys and girls during the first year of birth influences sex-based motor activity differences. The authors suggest that these motor differences disappear at around 3 months, then appear at 5 months and subsequently increase in size, evidencing motor activity as being an assembled state. Parenting also influences the behaviors assembled by children from an early age. Fausto Sterling, Kroll, and Lamar note that mothers hold 3-week female infants at a distance but hold male infants more frequently, as well as stimulate and look at them more. Particularly, movement by female infants is responded to speaking or looking, while that of male infants by holding or touching. These maternal behaviors translate into male infants sleeping less and crying more. Fathers apply different parenting approaches, and as such, combining maternal-paternal care with same or opposite sex nature of the adult-infant dyad contributes to sex-related infant differences. Neonatal activity levels affect prenatal development in boys and girls differently, motor favoring boys and sensitivity favoring girls. Fausto Sterling, Kroll, and Lamar maintain that neural developmental gender-based differences even out at 4 months, with subsequent divergence arising from language interaction, affected development, and parent-infant motor simulation. The authors suggest, and I quote, "Sex-related activity differences at birth can be understood as an attractor state underlain by some constellation of physiological system states. As these systems develop during the first 4 months, the strength of the motor activity attractor diminishes, but in months 5 to 12 a new and partially sex-differentiated activity attractor emerges. These new attractors would bear the history of the older, primarily physiologically based underpinnings, but differ from these because they have new social systems, parent-infant dyadic interactions, contributing to their soft assembly. This phenomenon implies that activity levels are semi-stable states, with differences at birth having different underpinnings with those at various stages of development." Spencer and colleagues argue that infant behaviors and thermodynamic systems become unstable during periods of change, with both tending to shift towards organization.